Howdy, y'all. Zach Carell here from the Yak Legion Podcast. Me and Chris Anderson tonight. We are talking with the man, the myth, the legend, Steve Coomer. How's it going, Steve?
Oh, I'm fine, guys. I don't know about all that, but I'm just a good old boy that fishes a lot. You know.
Oh man, you're modest, man. You are a great fisherman, and you know what? You've taught the whole Cincinnati area how to fish, how to catch bass, and I think everyone that's serious about fishing in this area follows you. I think most of us have copies of your books, and I know I love reading your write-ups on the Ohio game fishing. Your old stinky guy on there, and then on Facebook, you do a lot of great write-ups.
Oh, thank you.
Right. So I know starting out, Chris had something he's just chomping at the bit to ask you.
Well, one of the things that I think is going to be really, really important, especially for the generations to come, and you touch on it quite a bit in your books, and then also kind of even the history that you've seen as you've grown up on the river and gone through. But, it's awesome to have this fishery that we have now and the fisheries local that we have now. But what can we do as anglers to ensure, in your opinion, the Little Miami River in particular, but not only that, but all the bodies of water around us, sustainability for my daughter and my daughter's kids to be able to fish?
Almost every watershed in Ohio has a conservancy group of private individuals besides the state that works towards that piece of water. And I'm most familiar with the Little Miami Conservancy, and they have literally changed the Little Miami River in my lifetime more than anything else involved with the river. 53% of the riverbank of the Little Miami is now protected in one way or the other. And most of it you don't notice, you don't realize that you see a farm, but the Little Miami Conservancy pays that farmer, a conservation easement, so he doesn't farm 100. He has to farm so far back from the river, and so that runoff gets to filter through that riparian habitat, and they also operate almost 100 nature preserves on the Little Miami River, and most of them aren't marked at all. There's stakes in the ground, and that's all there is, and they just leave them alone. They don't develop them in any way. They don't put any parking lots in. They don't put anything. It's just, here's a chunk of what you think is woods out in the middle of nowhere, and it's always going to be that way because of the Little Miami Conservancy. And almost every river has a conservancy group like that. And probably the biggest thing I think that an individual could do, besides just not throwing his crap in the river, is to contribute to a group like that. I think that would make a huge difference down the road.
How would our listeners and ourselves, as importantly as our listeners, get in touch with the Little Miami Conservancy and become involved?
They have a website, littlemiamiconservancy.org, and there's actually a button on there that says "How can I help?" and I think you give them your email address, and they operate a lot of river cleanups, where a bunch of guys will go down, they'll clean up the river and things like that. But you can go to their website, and that's probably the easiest way that I would know to do that. If I could throw out one more thing, you were talking about the river changing in my lifetime. I grew up, on a hill overlooking the Little Miami River, and have just been intimate with that river my entire life. And believe it or not, the Little Miami is in the best shape it's been in the last 50, 60 years. The studies show that there are more smallmouth bass in the Little Miami River than there were 20 years ago, and there's less carp in the Little Miami River than there was 20 years ago, because as the waters change and clear up, there's more food for smallmouth bass and less food for carp. It'll never be like it was, in the 1800s or something, but it'll be the cleanest version of this river we can get. We're getting real close to that right now. I think about 97, 98% of Little Miami is classified excellent warm water habitat by the Department of Natural Resources. So it's in pretty good shape right now.
Wow.
And but there's 3 million people I think live in the watershed. So it wouldn't take much. It wouldn't take much slippage for it to go the other way fast because there's so many people. It actually owes a lot to the Department of Natural Resources and the Little Miami Conservancy.
I know that's one of the cleanest rivers I've ever been on. I've kayaked it, waded it, fished it, and it's so clean. There's no garbage. I mean, you do have an occasional bad fisherman that leaves their trash, but I've been in the Scioto River, the Ohio River, and they are just mucked up. They're trashed, and the Little Miami River is absolutely beautiful.
I fished the Great Miami a lot. Like I always lived on the Little Miami and then worked by the Great Miami. And the Great Miami is a tremendous fishery, but there's an awful lot of old bait tubs and line, and they don't compare for the quality of the experience. There's no doubt the Great Miami might be a better place to catch a big smallmouth bass, but you're going to have a better experience on the Little Miami, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
So with that, between those two rivers, if you have your choice to fish, are you going to fish the Little Miami more often than you are the Great Miami?
I guess it would depend on where you're located. The Great Miami, I would say, up around Tip City and north of Dayton, that top third of the Great Miami is probably a good a smallmouth stream as there is in the state of Ohio. But close to me, the Little Miami I would probably lean towards the Little Miami. If you're asking me what river in Ohio that I would pick to only fish one for the rest of my life, it wouldn't be either one, though. I'll throw you guys a curve.
Wow, that was a question. That was my follow-up question, and you did throw a curveball right at the beginning. This is my first show.
My follow-up to that is that I think the best smallmouth stream in the state of Ohio is Scioto Brush Creek.
Oh, wow.
I really do. I think, but the problem with Scioto Brush Creek is that there's no access. You kind of have to know the good old boys that live along it, But it's exceptional habitat. It's one of the few places you can go and catch a smallmouth bass in lily pads, and there's muskies, and I love Scioto Brush Creek. But the problem is you can't just head out there and go fishing. It takes a little research because the access is so rough. It's kind of like Todd's Fork on the Little Miami. Todd's Fork is an exceptional stream, but there's not a whole lot of it's private,
Yeah.
The public water, that you can get on real easy, probably the Little Miami is the best around. I mean, heck, there's the bike trail for 90 miles of it, that you've got great access to.
Can you get access to some of these creeks on kayak if you stayed in your kayak, or a lot of them too shallow, you'd have to get out, or?
Todd's Fork gets low in the late summer. You would probably want to kayak it, earlier in the summer. It's funny, like the Little Miami, even though Todd's Fork is like the second biggest tributary of the Little Miami, it doesn't have the Little Miami is fed a lot by groundwater, and the Little Miami and Todd's Fork is more fed by drainage and runoff, and so it drops lower in late summer. Scioto Brush Creek, you could kayak any time of the year as long as you could find yourself a good get on and get off spot.
Wow, that's awesome. So before we get into fishing, I had another question for you. Now, you've been running the creeks a lot, the rivers. Do you ever find like ancient Indian artifacts? I know there was a lot of Shawnee. I'm trying to think of the word. There was a lot of Shawnee settlements along the Little Miami River. You ever come across anything strange?
I really love that stuff, and nothing more exciting than a few arrowheads. I found quite a few arrowheads, and I make it a point to try to visit like any cool sites if I'm going to go fishing somewhere.
Yeah.
If you ever go to my Facebook page, there's a million pictures of half the Indian mountains in southern Ohio. I think it's awesome, but I haven't ever found anything much more along those lines than Arrowhead. I mean, I found some wild stuff as much as I've been on the river, but not anything ancient.
Wow. Yeah, I see a lot of your posts during the winter time. It seems like you go to a lot of Indian mounds around here and visit.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just something to do when the fishing's off.
Yeah. One of the things that I just find really interesting is even your photos of just morels or, mushrooms and flowers.
Yeah.
So for a guy that, like me, I want to show my fish off as much as possible, and you obviously do a great job with that. But to you, it seems like it's just as much to see some beautiful wildflowers and to take a picture of that as you've got on your as many as you have fish, and they're equally impressive.
Well, let's see, I'll give you a little background on me. I have a pretty decent job that has me working days. My wife has an exceptional job, but she has to work evenings. So every evening, it's like, well, I got to kill some time somehow, so I'm going to go fishing. So I go fishing, 150 or 200 days a year. And so while I'm out there so much, you see so much, I think I do, get as excited about a cool tree or something as I do the fish anymore. I've done an awful lot of fishing.
Oh yeah, you have. Speaking of fishing, I know we're not going to ask you about any of your smallmouth spots, but I know you mentioned you didn't like to give away your smallmouth spots. Why is that?
In a smaller river, and in creeks especially, smallmouth bass are not what you would expect. Like in Dale Hollow, they may follow big schools of bait fish and be here today, and then they're 2 miles down the lake tomorrow, or out on a hump or something. In a small river or a stream, smallmouth bass are true to one section of the river or stream their entire life. And study after study, I've probably seen 15 or 20 studies on this. And that smallmouth bass, he'll go somewhere where he's going to spend the winter, and then he'll spawn in the spring, and then he goes back to his summer haunt, and he stays there until time for him to go somewhere to spend the winter again. And he does that every year of his life. And so if you're going to catch a trophy smallmouth bass, you have to find somewhere that, some redneck hasn't knocked him in the head and put him in a 5-gallon bucket and taken him home. He's got to live 10 or 15 years in the same section of stream. And so it's not like I can tell you, hey, you should go to this place. And, if you catch a big smallmouth bass and you take him home to be mounted, or you just handle him rough and he dies, there's not like there's one that moves in tomorrow to take his place. It might be 7 or 8 years. I caught the same 20-inch smallmouth bass, I'm positive 3 times, and I think I caught him 4 times. It's just that I never thought to check, the first time. But it has a funky looking fin on it, and it's real distinctive, and there's no not recognizing this fish. And I caught him 4 times because I let it go. And they're just too precious to risk, I think. I think everyone should go out and smallmouth bass fish, and I'm gladly tell you how I catch a big smallmouth bass, but I'm not going to say, hey, go fish here.
Yeah.
The most I'll do is say, hey, go to the Little Miami, or hey, go to Scioto Brush Creek, or something like that, where you've got 100 miles to find your own spot.
Yeah, and if you fish 150 to 200 days a year, multiply that times 4 hours. How many thousands of hours are we looking at that you found that fish, that you found that spot? And
there's certain spots, like for trophy smallmouth bass, I usually don't fish wood in the river just because wood doesn't stay there forever. I'm a big fan of fishing like the biggest chunk of rock and the biggest chunk of concrete and rubble that I can that creates a really strong seam. And most of those are there year after year, flood after flood. And if you find that spot, I'm fishing some of the exact same spots that I fished 15 or 20 years ago. And 30 years of going 150 days a year, you're bound to any moron can find enough spots to fish, and I'm not saying I'm a genius. I've just done it so much that I've built up almost like a trap line. You go here and you fish this spot, and then you go here and you fish this spot. Anymore, I don't normally for smallmouth bass fish a mile and a half a river. I'll go somewhere and I'll fish 100 yards, and then I'll hop in the kayak or hop in the truck and I'll go a mile and fish this other specific 100 yards that I feel like will hold a big fish. Because I don't know, maybe it's I don't know. For me, what gets me off fishing is trying to catch a big smallmouth bass. I don't normally, if you notice, I don't normally post, I caught 17 or I caught 16 or I caught so many. I'll have a picture of that one fish that, I'm after just that one fish. And that's just kind of the way I do it, I guess.
So that 20-inch fish that's living in there that you've caught 4 times, what would you say the age of that fish is? And maybe even starting from like a 16-inch, which I think a lot of people on the river would consider a really nice smallmouth to catch and enjoy catching that. But, from 16 inches up to 20 inches, what kind of longevity do those guys have?
It is amazing how old those fish are. I mean, it's like a 20-inch smallmouth bass, I think in Ohio, is like precocious and way ahead of the game if he's got that big in 10 or 12 years. More than likely it's 14. I've seen some studies on like the Susquehanna and the New and places that are 100 times better rivers than we have. And the James River, I know one 20-inch smallmouth bass was almost 20 years old. Wow. And that's on the James, which is a whole heck of a lot better, river than any we have around here. And so, that fish is probably 14, 12, 14, 16 years old. So he's a pretty precious resource. I'm not against keeping fish at all. I'll go out and normally when years that are normal river levels and it's not been raining every 2 minutes like it is this year, yeah. I'll go out and I'll go out on a Friday night and I'll spend the night. I'll kayak down somewhere and find a nice spot to camp and put me up a camp, and I might try to catch a nice channel cat and eat it. I'm not against catching, keeping fish. I am against keeping smallmouth bass out of rivers because you're taking something out of there that there's a good chance you may be dead and gone before the next one gets that big in that spot.
There's something I heard about eating smallmouth and largemouth bass that the University of Science actually did a study that it causes testicular cancer if you eat a largemouth or smallmouth bass. So that's something you definitely would want to avoid, right?
I think even if that's not the case, I think it's a great thing to tell everybody you possibly can that that's the case. I like it.
The same study proved that channel cats and crappie make awesome sandwiches.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love to eat fish. I just don't think there's a few things you shouldn't. You shouldn't eat a big shovelhead. It took him a long time to get that old. There's just certain fish that you shouldn't.
Yeah, the big ones don't taste very good anyway. The eating size ones, that's the littler ones, the ones you want to catch and eat.
Sure. Yeah, and the both of the rivers that I fish the most, have saugers and sawguys, that are the world's best eating fish.
Oh yeah.
And they're stocking the sawguy. They're not naturally reproducing, so it's not like you're taking breeders out or doing whatever, you can eat a saugeye and not feel bad about it.
Oh yeah. So back to smallmouth. What's the biggest smallmouth bass you've ever caught?
The biggest smallmouth bass I ever caught was definitely cheating because I was in the boundary waters up in Minnesota. So that's a whole different world. It was 23 inches, little over 23 inches long.
Wow.
I'm guessing 6.5 or something.
Yeah.
The 21-inch smallmouth bass that I've caught out of a river or stream, you could probably count, on one hand or just a little over. I think it's almost like a special case, especially in the Little Miami. The Great Miami, there's a few more 20-inch smallmouth bass. They're still really rare, but back when but the Little Miami, they're really rare. I think the average fish dies of old age when it's 19 or 19 and a half inches long, and it takes an exceptional piece of habitat or just a really good spot and some lucky genetics and a little bit of luck for one to reach 20 inches in the Little Miami. I know back when the state of Ohio, it used to be that you had to catch a 20-inch smallmouth bass out of a river or stream to get a Fish Ohio award.
Yeah.
There was I think a couple hundred or something were all that were turned in the entire state, and the vast majority of those were either in Lake Erie or the stuff that ran into Lake Erie. The Great Miami, I think, produced like 20 something of them the last year that it was a 20-inch smallmouth bass. So it was far and away the best stream in southern Ohio to produce a 20-inch smallmouth bass.
Wow.
I would think your best chances are the Great Miami, the Whitewater, and then the Little Miami in southwestern Ohio. There's some streams out in southeastern Ohio that you probably got a good chance. That probably are as good as the Great Miami if more people could get access and more people fishing.
In your book, and I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, you walk down the fishing from the top of Little Miami down to the bottom. If we're looking at, you said the biggest one that you ever hooked got away, and I think it was that Just North of Loveland?
Yes.
Can you walk us through that? And if you had if you didn't have, obviously you didn't have a tape to put them on or a catch board to put them on to get that length, what was your estimate on that fish? And
that fish was at least a 21-inch smallmouth bass. And I'm going to say at least. He was big, like unbelievably big. The problem with that fish was that I hooked that fish in late fall, right before they shut down for the winter, and in the most exceptional wintering hole. There's about 6 or 8 in the whole length of Little Miami that are just obviously superior to all the others, and this was one of the really superior wintering holes. And I think in southern Ohio, some fish, especially in the bigger streams like the Scioto and the Great Miami, they might not migrate a long ways to where they're going to spend the winter. They may do a little bit more concentrating than migrating. I do feel that in our smaller streams that a lot of the best fish, especially the trophy fish, migrate to a really good spot to spend the winter. We're kind of on the edge of where fish in Wisconsin, they might migrate 30 or 40 miles to find the best spot. In Tennessee or Alabama, they may not migrate at all. And we're kind of in between the two. And so the problem with that big smallmouth bass is that it was in this exceptional wintering hole. The water temperature was, 56 degrees. I have no idea where that fish come from. He could have come 5 or 6 miles and into that hole. And so if I lose a big smallmouth bass, I want to lose him now. I want to lose him in July, August, September, before the autumnal equinox. That way, I know that because I fish a lot of smaller streams, I know that fish is going to be there, and all of a sudden, I'm up a little bit because now I know where home is. You know what I mean? And if I spend enough time, every time I talk about fishing 3 or 4 spots, and then moving down the kayak. If I hit that spot, 50 times that year, I'm going to catch that fish. But if I hook him, if I hook that fish right before the spawn, where they're migrating out of the wintering holes to where they're going to spawn, or if I hook that fish in the winter, in the winter or in the fall, I don't know, he could leave, So and that's the problem with that fish. I don't know where it came from. Unfortunately, that fish haunts me, and that's for years. And that fish haunts me more than any fish I ever caught. Actually, the ones that get away, I guess, always bother you more than the ones you catch.
Yeah.
What did you hook up with? What did you hook him on temporarily?
I know exactly what it was. It was a smoked metal flake 3-inch curly tail grub. I'm guessing that 50% of the big smallmouth bass, by big I mean 20 inches or better, that I've ever caught out of a river or stream are on a 3-inch grub. I have no idea why. It just works. I feel like that it's not that it's the wonder lure, but that it fishes extremely well in the spots that I try to catch a big smallmouth bass in. Not that it's a wonder lure, but it, the idea is you use the best lure for that spot. And the best spot to catch a big smallmouth bass is, at least in my experience, everything is also predicated on, we're talking about Southern Ohio. If you go to Tennessee or you go to West Virginia or someplace, it may not be the same. And that might be an interesting thing to talk about in a minute. But in Southern Ohio, the best spot to catch a big smallmouth bass is a seam where really, really fast water is right against really slow water. And that big smallmouth bass can lay in there and use his lateral line, and he can dart out there and get, ambush something without expending a lot of energy. And a grub just really fishes really good in that heavy current. You can fish across stream and pitch it slightly upstream and let it sweep down right through that seam. And that's why I think it's an exceptional big smallmouth lure in Southern Ohio. I'm not sure that it would be if we're fishing the New or the Susquehanna or something. And the reason, I'm just going to rattle on for a minute here while I'm rolling, if you guys don't mind. The reason I think is that, if you walk out into the Great Miami or you walk out into a pool in the Little Miami, either one, in a pool, you walk out in there, and what is the bottom in the pools? It's 1.5 feet of muck. It's 1.5 feet of farmland that is washed into the river. And that is the reason that the Little Miami will never be the river it was, 200 years ago, is because we farmed so much and all that runoff has filled the pools up with sediment. And that to me translates into why I think a seam is your best spot to catch a big smallmouth bass in the Little Miami River, because those pools aren't the crayfish factories that if you were fishing the Big South Fork down in Tennessee and you wade out in the pools have rocks and they've got ledges and the pools are full of crayfish. There's food, on the bottom in the pools. In Southern Ohio, the food is all in the riffles or a really strong seam, just because, honestly, there's those 100-yard pools in the Little Miami that are waist deep, that they're just deserts for smallmouth bass because the bottom's too soft. And that's why I like to fish a grub in a seam. If, one of the potential questions you asked me was beforehand, you said I might ask me if I could only fish 2 lures, in our rivers and streams. I would fish a swim bait or a grub, and the other lure I would choose absolutely positively is a buzz bait. I have no science behind that fact, but for some reason, a buzz bait catches big smallmouth bass. I don't know why. At least it does in southwestern Ohio. It is definitely a lousy smallmouth bass lure. You're not going to go out and catch 30 of them. Yeah. But if you catch 30 on a buzz bait over the course of 2 weeks or something in the Little Miami River, if you can catch 30 on a buzz bait, one of them will be 19 inches longer or longer. So I throw a buzz bait in the Little Miami and don't expect to catch musk, but expect to catch a big one eventually.
I love throwing a buzz bait.
Absolutely. And I don't throw a smallmouth bass buzz bait. You know how they talk about the little 2.5, 3-inch buzz bait, and they're like, oh, that's, you know what I mean, that's a river and stream smallmouth bass one. I'm throwing something, 3/4 of an ounce with a big triple wing blade on it that looks like it should something you would throw in Florida. And I don't know why, but smallmouth bass, they're normally particular about, what they eat and everything, and something about a buzz bait trips the trigger in them. And I'm a big fan. If you don't know, say you don't know, and I don't know why, but they like it.
And if you're throwing that buzz bait, are you searching that same seam from the either the riffle or the strong current that cut?
The spot, where I'm trying to catch a big smallmouth bass, I usually throw a swim bait or a grub, and then it's a mile or 3/4 of a mile to the next one. Then searching in between there is where I'm going to throw a buzz bait. On the rock bar on the inside of every bend, how there's always a rock bar there, that's where I want to throw a buzz bait, or if any seam that I see going down through there. And if there's wood there, I'll throw a buzz bait by it. It's probably my search bait for a big smallmouth bass. A lot of people use something like a rebel crawl or a little rapala, while they're going along, and I think they're wonderful to catch a bunch of fish on, but I feel like if you use a buzz bait, your chances of catching a big fish just went up tremendously, for sure.
I know you'd mentioned about matching the hatch on some of your posts. What are some of the prominent types of bait fish in these local rivers? Not just bait fish, but like insects that smallmouth go after.
Because of our soft bottoms in our streams, we don't have a big hellgrammite population. With the work that the Little Miami Conservancy's done cleaning up the Little Miami, there starting to be some more hellgrammites in the Little Miami. I talked to the lady that does the testing for the EPA, and she said that probably centered on where Caesars Creek runs into the Little Miami, it seems that was about the spot that the hellgrammites, their stronghold, and they're kind of working their way upstream and downstream from there. So that Fort Ancient area, I might, especially if I'm using a fly rod, I might throw a hellgrammite. I'm not the biggest fan of imitating the crayfish in the Little Miami River because of the I just feel like your chances of catching a big fish are better on imitating a bait fish. In some of the tributaries, that changes completely. If you go to 4 Mile Creek that runs into the Great Miami, and you're wading the stream and looking down, you might see, in the course of a day, you might see a couple hundred little crayfish. scurrying along. You're never going to get that in the Little Miami. You're going to have some crayfish, but there's not that big a population. So I'm usually trying to fish something that swims in the Little Miami. The most common bait fish in the Little Miami is something called a central stone roller, and that's a little guy that he goes along, and he's kind of a brown with some different spots on him, kind of brown spotted little fish, and he picks algae off of the rocks, and that's the most common fish in the Little Miami. Individual species. Maybe the most common type of fish in the Little Miami, at least in the parts of the Little Miami where the smallmouth bass would be feeding at, close to the riffles and on the hard bottoms, might be some kind of darter. I did some math, and I grew up in South Lebanon, and one of the testing spots for the EPA was right below the 48 bridge in South Lebanon. There's a big, long, shallow set of, bunch of riffles. And I was adding up all the different fish. The EPA does testing on the river, and they electroshock the river, and then they tell you what they call of each thing. And consistently throughout the years, about 25 to 30% of all the fish of all the species that they electrofish in that section of the Little Miami are some kind of darter species. It's kind of split up between. There's about a dozen different kinds of darters in the Little Miami, so I don't think it beats the central stone roller just because there's so many different species. I think in total, maybe a darter might be the ideal thing to fish in the Little Miami, especially because it's in the riffles and the rocks and the seams where a big smallmouth bass would be.
What about something that imitates a creek chub? I know guys catch a lot of smallmouth on real creek chubs.
Yeah, I agree. I think the like third or fourth on the list, and then is different kinds of shiners and chubs and things, and I think especially as you get into the pool, my kind of theory on it is that if I'm in the pool, I'm usually throwing something a little flatter in profile and a little bit lighter and more of a fish color, that's going to imitate a shiner or a shad or a creek chub. And then the closer I get to the riffle, the more rounded and dark colored and grub, motor oil, smoked metal flake grub color in shape imitates a darter better. So it's kind of dependent on whether I'm fishing in the pool or fishing closer to the riffle. The Great Miami, the most common bait fish in the Great Miami is a spot fin shiner by a lot. And if you fish the Great Miami, I think you want to fish something. In the Little Miami, I'm going to fish a smoked metal flake grub a lot. In the Great Miami, I'm going to fish like a curly shad or something that's flatter in profile and a little lighter colored, because there's an awful lot of shiners in the Great Miami. And surprisingly, the tributaries that run into each of these rivers have a completely different forage base. Todd's Fork is overrun with central stone rollers. Like 80% of the minnows in a lot of electric fishing things are central stone rollers. And I know that a whole bunch of the streams, probably at least 50% of the streams that run into the Great Miami are covered up in central stone rollers, but in the main stream of the river itself, there's a lot more shiners and spot fin shiners. So it pays to do a little research. You can go, if you do a little Googling, I'm trying to think of this off the top of my head, the EPA studies for each of the streams will tell you, there's, and the cool part is they electrofish every stream big enough to fish in the Ohio at about 4 or 5 mile intervals, and so you can find the section that you fish all the time, and you can look at that and you can be like, wow, where I fish, there's a whole lot of spot fin shiners and rainbow darters, and so I want stuff that looks like rainbow darters and spot fin shiners.
Mm.
Now I remembered. I've been sitting here trying to think of it. It's the Water Quality and Biological Studies Index, EPA. And so if you go there and then you look in the appendices of the studies, it'll tell you wherever you fish, what are the predominant bait fish, what are the predominant insects, how many crayfish they caught. It's really, it is really an amazing way to spend, a couple winter days when you don't have nothing better to do. You can spend hours poring over that stuff. I think it's amazing how much the internet has changed smallmouth bass fishing, even though smallmouth bass fishing is a bunch of good old boys like me that just get in the river and wade and, do what they've always done for 40 years. But you can really do a little bit of research, and, the EPA studies, and the other big thing is Google Maps. Google Maps, you can zoom in on the river and spend a winter's day looking at, the main stem of the Darby, and go in as close as you want to and be like, well, this summer I've been wanting to go up there. I need to try here and I need to try there and I can put in here. I think the internet has changed stream smallmouth fishing more than any lure or technique or anything. I really do.
Well, look at Google Earth. You can get online. You can look up satellite images of the whole stretch of the river.
Yeah, you just zoom in as close as it'll let you, and you're not going to find every spot, but you can get yourself started. Doing that, I try to find complex pieces of the river, where there's islands and sharp turns and you obvious stuff in the stream, and that'll get you started. A lot of the really cool stuff, though, you're going to have to find on your own, because the very best stuff is one big refrigerator-sized piece of concrete that 80 years ago there was a factory and they didn't know what to do with it, and they bulldozed it over in the river, and it's been sitting there for 80 years creating this big super scene. And some of that stuff you can't see on Google Earth, but
yeah,
if you're definitely starting off as a novice and trying to find this somewhere to get started, Google Earth's the way to go.
Oh, I agree.
That's just an amazing thing that I would never even crossed my mind, that if I'm throwing white, and then white's my color, and it doesn't change from the riffles than it does in the pools, and that just completely opened my eyes to.
And, the cool part about that is, then if you want to take the time, in January, and you look at your stream, you can create for, I go to, you're like, well, I go to, river XYZ and I fish this 100-yard stretch of it because I can fish it every day when I get off work, and that's your home piece of water. You can make a lure selection for your home piece of water that is better than anybody else has in the world for your piece of water, because your piece of water is different than even the rest of the river, right? And especially different than any other river. There's about the Whitewater, the Great Miami, the Scioto, the Little Miami. There's anywhere between about 80 to 100 fish species in each one, and then the reason there's that many is that it varies. They're niches. They fill little niches in the river, so. This is a spot where this fish thrives, and it may not be 5 miles down the stream. So that's a liability and a blessing, because you can make your own tailor-made lure selection. Or you can follow the general rule of using a lighter, flatter one and bait fish in the pool, and then the closer you get to the river, go smaller and darker.
I know, I've seen you online before. You'll take white collared lures like minnows, and then you'll color them, and you'll look at the pictures online or from the ODNR books of the different darters and the bait fish, and you'll actually color them in to look exactly like that.
I'm not sure if that helps me or if it just gives me more confidence sometimes, which is just as good as helping you. I mean, that makes you throw 5 more casts at that spot if you got more confidence in it. I do think that some of the Ohio Department of Natural Resource stuff, it can really help you in your fishing. We were talking about going to the EPA and looking up, what's in the different spots. Well, that doesn't do you any good if you're trying to imitate, a creek chub in 6 inches of fast riffle. He's not there. He's back in the pool picking stuff off the top that's floating down. And so you figure out what's there, and then you go to the Department of Natural Resources stuff or some kind of resource that tells you about that fish, or just Google the name of that, Google spot fin shiner, and it'll tell you what one looks like. And then the cool part is it tells you how one behaves and what part of the river it lives in, and what it eats. And that way you're like, well, so when I'm in the pool, I want to throw this species, and then when I get closer to the riffle, it tells me that there's rainbow darters or greenside darters or something like that. And it is really helpful, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like it's, adding science to the science that we have available to us to the fishing to make the fish bite.
You can make it as complicated as you want to make it. Maybe I over time overcomplicated it, but that makes it more interesting to me. I want to know the whys, and then I feel like that, if you go somewhere else, you can apply that. Maybe you see something and you don't even know why, but you feel like, well, I feel like I should throw a such and such, and then it works. So I think that comes from years of trying to figure out why.
If you're going to go to, I know a lot of times we try to get the destinations, and we'll get together with guys for a weekend to hit the New River or to hit, somewhere down in Tennessee. It sounds to me like you would probably even take as much time as you would fishing for that experience to go ahead and do the same type of research for that, to hit the New River, to make sure that you're matching the hatch in those areas. If you're going on a trip, you're not going to bring...
Weirdest thing ever, and I don't know why, I've never smallmouth bass in the New River. It's definitely on bucket list of, I got to do that. The New River and the Susquehanna. I haven't. I have been to the Boundary Waters a few times and used to go to Dale Hollow a bunch, but I don't know why I've just not made it over there to do that. Usually if I go to West Virginia, I'm up in the mountains somewhere backpacking, and I end up fishing some little creek for trout. But it definitely is on the bucket list of places to go. Awesome. If I had to pick a destination fishing spot that I go to time and time again, out of Ohio, is I like to go to eastern Tennessee and striper fish. I mean, that's just like that's like the big game hunting and fishing to me. They're in a river, they're in the stuff I like, but then all of a sudden, you've got this chance of catching the gigantic fish. So I, 2 or 3 times a year, I'll head down there and go striper fishing.
I've seen you catch some big stripers.
Yeah,
I'm
really out of state, Smallmouth, I'm usually in state, and that's why I preface everything about, I can't tell you how to fish smallmouth in a lot of other states, because most of the time when I go out of state, I'm usually striper fishing, or till I got old and fat, my wife and I backpacked like 2-3 weeks every year for 25 years, and that was mostly up in the mountains, and so that's trout country with a fly rod. So the vast majority of my out-of-state fishing experience is up in the mountains with a fly rod or striper fishing, really. I probably need to do more smallmouth bass fishing out of state, but I do 150 or 200 days of it a year in state, so it's like when I go on vacation, I'm usually trying to do something a little more exotic, I guess.
Outside the box.
Yeah.
So out of those 200 days a year that you fish, what time of the year is best for smallmouth fishing, you think?
If you're trying to catch a big smallmouth bass, there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever that in the fall, when the water temperature drops below 65 degrees and down to where it hits 50, that is the best time of the year to catch a trophy smallmouth bass. If you know where to fish. If you don't know where to fish, it may be the worst time of the year to catch a trophy smallmouth bass, because I said those fish concentrate and they move to where they're going to spend the winter. And so if you know the right spot, you might have fish from 2 or 3 miles upstream and out of a couple small feeder creeks and a couple miles downstream, all on the same ripple for 3 weeks. And normally the peak is right around the last of October, 1st of November. That's, to me, if I was going to stake my life on a 2-week period that I had to catch a trophy smallmouth bass in southern Ohio, I would say it would be the first 2 weeks in November.
Wow.
What's your typical rod and reel setup when you're going for those? And throwing, sounds like more often than not at that time of the year, probably not the buzzbait, but more that 3-inch grub.
There is if I had the perfect rod and reel for each one, they would be a little bit different. But the rod that I use, vast majority of the time, smallmouth bass fishing, is a 7.5 foot medium fast spinning rod, made locally, Little Miami Rod Company by Jeff Bird out of Morrow, Ohio, and he makes. But it's a 7.5 foot medium fast spinning rod with a Fluger spinning reel on it. I'm a huge fan of river fishermen using Fluger spinning reels, because you can take a Fluger spinning reel and you can throw it in the water and then you can drag it out and it's still the same. There's lots of really nice smooth reels, but those are sealed really well, and I fish so much that at least once a week the thing's got inundated in the water, or it's got mud all over it, and they just take a licking and keep on ticking. I'm a huge fan of Fluger spinning reels.
I got a Fluger, the President, I think, and I love that little reel.
Yeah, I think you cannot, they have more expensive models, but a President's about $60 or something.
Yeah.
And that's the best bargain there is in bass fishing, probably. And then I'm gonna spool it up with something that no one uses anymore, and that's plain old monofilament. And the reason I'm going to do that is, I do a lot of hybrid fishing. This year with the high water, I've done a ton of hybrid striper fishing, more than I have in years.
Yeah, there's
and I'm fishing braid for hybrid stripers because it's strong, and you can use 15-pound test diameter. I mean, you can use 15-pound. It's not very big diameter, and it's strong. But hybrid stripers don't jump. Smallmouth bass jump. Everybody that smallmouth bass fishes knows that if you hook a big smallmouth bass, the most important time is that first jump. I mean, I don't know how many million times that fish has jumped out of the water, and you're like, then all the cursing starts because he threw it.
Yeah.
And that little bit of stretch in monofilament keeps you hooked up to that fish more than it does in braid, just because the fish jump. I think fish that jump, you're a lot better off using monofilament. A lot better off. I think you're going to land more trophy smallmouth bass on 8-pound test trilene than you are 12-pound braid of any sort.
No, that's awesome.
A lot of guys, they'll use braid and then they'll put a leader on, so, fluorocarbon to make it invisible. And yeah, you get a lot of bites.
Yeah.
And those are the guys that lose a lot of big smallmouth bass.
Wow. Chris has his hand up.
now, braid, striper fishing, hybrid striper fishing, braid all the day, every time, because you can cast with it and it's strong, and but that's my setup most of the time. If I know if I'm in the kayak and I can take more than one rod and reel, I'm going to use the other one's going to be more of a medium action, and it's going to I'm going to throw a buzz bait and a square bill crankbait on a slightly slower action. I think you hook more fish on a buzz bait with a slightly slower action than you do a really fast. The biggest problem with hooking a big smallmouth bass on a buzz bait is you taking it away from it. I think a slower action rod, and then it doesn't hurt your hookup, and that's in that slightly slower action then also makes him less likely to come off. In the middle of winter, when I'm fishing a hair jig or a little grub in the wintering hole, and I'm fishing, 3 days for that one bite, then I'm using an extremely fast action sensitive rod, the most sensitive rod I can buy for that.
Wow.
But the vast majority of my fishing is a 7.6 medium fast spinning rod.
And if we were to contact Jeff, we would ask for the Steve Coomer special.
Yeah, he would know. He would know what you're talking about. Sure, he would know what you're talking about. Yeah, I even had him build me an 8-foot rod for below the big dams down Tennessee for stripers, and that's the nice part about somebody like Jeff is you can tell him, well, this is what I want, and this is the kind of handle I like, and, I like this kind of guides, and you can make it however you want to, for the same price as if you're. Mind you, it's expensive. It's the price of a Loomis rod or something, but at least it's not made in China. There's some guy, it says Little Miami rod on the name on the rod for a reason, because the guy lives about 100 yards from Little Miami. I like that.
And then anytime you can buy local.
I sure wish somebody made something like a President, in Milford, but unfortunately they don't.
Yeah. So what's the biggest hybrid striper you ever caught, and what'd you catch it on?
The biggest hybrid striper I ever caught was in the Ohio River below a dam, and it was 29 inches long.
Nice.
And like a fat bluegill shaped, 29 inches long. I don't know, it was 14 or 15 pounds probably, I would guess, something like that. I caught a big hybrid striper this spring that was within a pound or so of that probably. I don't know if you've ever seen a picture of that, but that was a big. I caught a really big one a few weeks ago. But that was a few years ago in the Ohio. There's some big fish in the Ohio. If you're wanting to catch a real big hybrid striper, you'd probably be better off just joining the zoo below one of the dams, and fishing below one of the dams on the Ohio.
Wow.
Now, something you can do is that I used to work a job that was 4 days on, 3 days off, 3 days on, 4 days off. So I was off a ton, and we'd leave work and we would head for like Markland Dam or something, and it's pretty close to, it's within an hour of Cincinnati, and it's just south of Cincinnati and downstream on the Ohio River. And you could, rather than join that group of guys that's day fishing and taking their turn and throwing their big launcher up against the dam, you can fish at night, and the fish will move up shallow on the rock bars below the dams on the Ohio at night, and you can kind of fan out. And we caught some big fish like that. I caught a 36-inch pure striper down there one night about 2 o'clock in the morning about 20 years ago. And then my friend Dan caught a 36-inch striper about 4 years ago, doing the same thing. We were probably both times a half a mile below the main dam, and so you can, if you're willing to night fish, or you can catch them. Other than that, your best chance to catch a monster is probably joining the circus right up against the dam, and I hate that.
Yeah, there's a lot of. It's always crowded down there.
The best hybrid striper spot, and it's not a secret, so I can just blurt it out. The best hybrid striper spot in Ohio is below Meldal Dam on the Kentucky side. But the problem is, you stand there and you watch some guy cast, and he casts for a little bit, and then he hooks a hybrid striper, and then the next guy walks up and casts with his launcher, so he hooks a hybrid striper, and then the next guy does, and there's usually like 6 or 7 guys in a circle rotating in and out, and it's horrible. I hate it. I've done it a couple times with my friend Rob, and it's just not for me, Yeah, but
now, I know you recently won a Jackson Bite kayak from Loveland Canoe and Kayak. Man, how do you like that thing?
Oh, that thing's awesome. I like it a lot. It suits me better than a lot of other kayaks that maybe are really high end or something. And the reason for that is, like, I'm a spot fishing guy. I said I had like a trap line down the river almost. I'm going to fish here, and then I'm going to fish here, and I'm going to fish here. And so the ideal kayak for me is something that I can load and unload easy. It weighs 72 pounds, but you can still stand up in it. I can still load it, but it's really stable. I can stand up in it, I'm comfortable in it. I can sit in it all day long, but it gets me from spot to spot extremely well, and so I love it. I think it's pretty close to the perfect kayak for my type of fishing. If I did a lot of lake fishing, I would probably want a pedal kayak and all that kind of stuff, but it's going to weigh, you need a trailer and 2 guys, whatever. For me, I think it's pretty close to perfect.
They're perfect for the river, the smaller kayaks. That's a nice looking kayak. I was there when you won that, and that was an awesome, very awesome kayak.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of it. You can it's you would have to be, I don't know, you would have to be trying really hard to flip the thing. It's extremely stable, and and like I said, I can load it myself, which is a huge advantage to me.
Yeah, so you don't really fish off of it. You just use it to get from point A to point B, your different spots on your trap line.
I'll fish off of it some, but yeah, I'm fishing. It has a big weight capacity, so how I said earlier, I'm a huge fan of getting off work on Friday and going to the river and floating down the river and fishing 3 or 4 spots and finding me a good spot to spend the night, and then do the next thing in the morning and take out at noon, and I get to spend an evening and a night on the river. And because that thing holds so much, I can do that in style now. I can,
oh yeah.
You can take some stuff and make camp more comfortable.
Oh, great.
I love it.
So what would be probably your craziest story on the river in all your years of fishing?
Like that I've seen something crazy,
or something happened, or something funny happened?
The first thing that comes to mind is used to the J.B. Stewart plant pumped hot water into the Ohio River just upstream from Aberdeen, Ohio. And so in January, when the fishing sucks, you could go there and just kill big hybrid stripers. Like you could have, or if you weren't catching big ones, then that meant that day you were catching numbers, and you might catch 75 of them that weigh 1.5 pounds in January when it's 12 degrees.
Yeah, it's
Well,
fun. Huh?
yeah, they discharge water, and it goes about a mile down a almost looks like a river or a creek, and then it dumped into the Ohio, and that was about a cast across, and that whole thing was maybe shoulder deep or something, and me and my brother Vic was there, and this is probably, oh God, this is probably 25 years ago or so. We're there fishing, and here comes these two guys in a canoe, and it's about 8 or 9 degrees, and we're fishing right where the water comes out of the plant. Me and him, and then there's about 6 other people, on the bank fishing, and these guys flip their canoe, and it's 8 degrees.
Oh my God.
And it's not dangerous because the water is like 65 or 70, but it's 8 degrees air temperature, and the one guy is cursing out the other guy and yelling at him, and everybody watching's laughing, and they start getting mad, and they're yelling at the guys on the bank, and then the one of the guys on the bank's like, so there goes your paddle, and it's floating downstream, and they're running after it, and it was pretty memorable just to watch these two guys, because they were amazing. And they ended up, getting to shore, and then obviously taking off with a sprint for their car because it was like 9 degrees. That's probably the most memorable thing I can think of off the top of my head. That was just crazy.
Wow. Now, I know fishing is clearly a family affair for you. Where did you learn your love for the river and for the love of fishing?
Well, my grandfather lived in South Lebanon, which is right on the Little Miami. His farm was on a hill that, from the top of the hill, you could just look down and see the river. And then my dad, he sold my dad a little piece of land, so I grew up right there. And my grandfather and my uncle and my dad were big shovelhead fishermen, and they just lived. This is when there were dams on the Little Miami River back in the day, and they would fish the King's Dam every Friday night, every Saturday night. They go down the dam and shovelhead fish, or they go to Fort Ancient and something like that. So I grew up in just a family of guys that they basically spent all their time on the Little Miami River, so it was pretty natural. My dad is probably the one of the most outdoorsy guys I've ever been around, and he was a taxidermist for a living, and he mostly did a lot of deer, and he was also a fur buyer from trappers, and so just grew up around the outdoors, deer hunting and fishing. That's what I grew up with. Yeah.
That's awesome, man. I love hunting and trapping myself. I do a lot of trapping in the wintertime and hunting, and then fish the rest of the year.
Yeah. My dad was one of the biggest fur dealers in the state, and the first job I ever had was skinning muskrats. Really,
Wow.
I'd get so much to skin a muskrat, and that's what I did. So I guess I come by the outdoors natural, I guess.
Oh yeah, man. Born and raised in it for sure.
He would buy fur all winter, and and then in the summer, he had a big old 16-foot sea nymph, and we'd go to the Ohio, or we would go down to one of the lakes in Tennessee, and we might camp for 2 weeks at a time, and just fish. So that's how I grew up.
That's a great way to grow up, man. You had more tackle boxes than you had X boxes.
and then when he got older, he decided, you obviously know, since you've been around it, that the fur business isn't anything like it used to be, or so he opened a tackle store, and had a fishing tackle store in Morrow, Ohio for several years, and so just had. That's all I've ever known, I guess, is outdoor stuff.
Oh yeah, I know your brother's into it too. He designed the Vic Coomer lures.
Yeah. Vic's got. I think there's top quality stuff, and then there's top quality stuff that you can afford. And Vic tries to have stuff that you can afford. You know what I mean? Instead of there's 4 swim baits for $6 and something. You can afford to buy a pack of his and fish with them. Some stuff is, I think, so expensive that it makes you a worse fisherman to own it, because you're afraid that if I've got a $16 jerk bait, that I'm going to lose it. You know what I mean? And so he tries to give you good stuff at an affordable price, I guess.
Oh, great. Yeah, I like dealing with him. I know I've bought plenty of your guys' baits and caught plenty of fish off them curly shads.
Yeah. I think in a lot of situations, that's definitely my go-to hybrid lure. Is a curly shad for sure. And in a lot of situations, it's a great smallmouth lure. Like I said, depending, anywhere there's shiners or any kind of fish like that, it's probably my go-to first thing because of the profile of it.
Mm. So I know we're kind of running low on time, but I wanted to play a little game. I started this game with Josh Eldridge and Brad Hicks, and it's called the Fishing Scenario Game. So hopefully we can get through a couple scenarios. And what I want to do is I'm going to kind of explain a situation, explain the day, and then you would go about telling me how you would go about fishing it.
Okay.
So scenario number 1, say you're down at the Little Miami River and it's been raining all night. The river is up 3 or 4 foot. It's springtime. It's muddy. It's nasty looking, and it's an overcast day. How would you go about fishing?
The first thing I would do is try to see and find if there's a little creek that's coming in clear, because that's a magnet. A lot of times in the spring, I'm a huge fan of fishing when the river's still muddy and the stuff coming in is clear. That is a gold mine in my book. I love that stuff, or vice versa. If something's coming in muddy and the river's clear, but most of the time it's usually the river's muddy and trying to. I would try to find somewhere clear. And if not, then there's a lot of studies that show, even though I said before that I don't imitate a crayfish much in the Little Miami, that there's some studies that I've seen that fish eat a higher percentage of crayfish when the water is muddy. And I don't know if it's because they can search in the rocks and it's more of a close in. They're nosing around, they find the crayfish and they can get it, as opposed to they're trying to chase down shiners out in the pool. So if it's muddy, I'm probably going to fish closer to the rocks and a little more on the bottom than I would in normal water conditions.
I got one, if you don't mind, Zach, because I think we're getting ready to get to this time of year is when, hopefully, if it ever really does kind of level out with the rain, that the water's down.
Mm-hmm.
And we're in the heat dog days of summer, and we know that we have the potential to hit those fish early, but after say 9:30, 10 o'clock, that bite starts to die off, where you're not seeing them in some of the typical places that you've seen them before.
This is going to sound really crazy. You know how I said in the fall, that the best time of year to catch a really big smallmouth bass, first couple of weeks in November. My favorite time of year to smallmouth bass fish is when it is hot as blazes.
Really?
And the river is low. And you wait. When it gets hot and the river gets low, just kind of remember this conversation when you start seeing me post some really big smallmouth bass. What happens then is that in their section of river, the water temperature is hot, the oxygen levels are a little lower than they were. Well, there are spots then that are wetter than the other spots because there's fast water and it's a little more oxygenated and there's more current. And I try to find, the hotter it gets, I try to find the very fastest spot in the entire river. I want somewhere that you're like, man, if I wade out there, I'm going to drown. And that's the spot that I want to fish when it's blazing hot. I want to fish the riffles, or even better, a really fast slot in a riffle, or going around the bridge abutment where it's just, the water is just tearing through there, and the river's low and it's clear and it's hot, and I'm throwing a 3/8 ounce jig head, or because it's the only thing I can get down on the, it's the only thing I can fish in water that fast. And there may be only one spot in 3 miles of river that's perfect like that. But when it's perfect like that, I know that if there's a nice smallmouth bass and he calls that piece of river home, that's where he's going to be if he's in the mood to eat. And a lot of times it's right in the middle of the day. I would try to find a bridge abutment or a railroad abutment or something like that the current is hitting it really hard and it is going really fast. I think I talked about that in Loveland where you were at, that the current rips along that face of that concrete, and then it creates like a little pocket just 5 or 6 inches wide right on that concrete if the current's fast enough. And I love fishing, smallmouth bass fishing in the middle of the day when it's blazing hot. But 90% of the river is terrible and sucks. Maybe 98% of the river. But if you can find the very fastest spot, no spot is too shallow or too fast when it's really hot. It just has to be really fast. And it can be 6 inches of water if it's so fast you can't hardly stand up in it. And there'll be smallmouth bass. He'll find himself a spot in there somewhere behind a little rock, or somewhere that he can station close to that really fast water. And I think it's a big fish thing. I feel like that the faster that current is, that big smallmouth bass, he's got that real long lateral line, and that fast water magnifies his advantage over the bait fish, because they've got like a 2-inch lateral line or an inch long lateral line, and his is 18.5 inches long, and it's just like an antenna on a radio. He can see through that fast water better with his long lateral line. The minnow doesn't know he's there, but he can tell a minnow's coming and eat it. And faster and the hotter and nastier the river gets, the more I like it. I know that's crazy and against what conventional wisdom, and in conventional wisdom for 98% of the river, probably 99% of the river, is that it sucks. But if you can find that super fast spot that you're like, man, I'm going to drown, that's where you want to be.
Wow, good answers, man. I got one more for you. This is going to throw you off a little bit. It's not about rivers. Say you go fish a marshy wildlife area pond. And I'm talking about, it's got cattails along the side. It's got duckweed, maybe some lily pads. The water is dark, almost that black. Sort of like if you've been to the marsh at Indian Creek. Sure. They pull 6-pounders out of the spring out of there sometimes. And how would you go about fishing a wildlife area pond, like a marshy wildlife area pond, like in the middle of summer, like right now?
The biggest largemouth I ever caught in Ohio, I caught a couple of big ones down in Florida and Georgia, but the biggest in Ohio was out of a wildlife area pond. And I love, most people are huge fans of frogs. I like that, like a 6-inch plastic worm that's like the ribbony snake looking one, big rigged weightless, and you can throw him and he'll come back through anything. And when that big largemouth comes up and gobbles it, everybody that's a fanatical frog fisherman knows that you're doing really good if you hook 25 or 30% of the strikes you get on a big Texas rigged plastic worm, you're just going to hook more fish. I'd use an unweighted Texas rig plastic worm. I used
What
to
size
do
plastic worm?
probably a 6 or 7 inch plastic worm.
So big plastic worm.
A big plastic. My a little interesting side note, I guess. When we were real young, me and Vic were the biggest trespassers in the state of Ohio when we were kids. we snuck in every farm pond within like a 50-mile radius in the middle of the night, and we would use a really big plastic worm, or we'd use a musky jitterbug, and a big musky jitterbug, and you would cast that out and try to sneak it back to you. I know that sounds funny, but you know, you're just barely making it wobble back to you, and we caught some gigantic largemouth bass at night doing that.
Wow.
The biggest one was out of a wildlife. He was a little over 23 inches long. I'm guessing pushing 7 pounds or 7.5 or something.
Yeah.
And out of a float tube, which was really cool. It actually spun me around a few times in the float tube. That was pretty cool.
That's awesome.
And
So how do you work those worms? Do you finesse them? I'm sorry.
Yeah, you know, you can slap that thing up on pads or stuff, and it'll just snake. It'll come through anywhere a frog will, you know. But yeah, I think, you know, it hits soft and natural, and it just looks lifelike, and that's probably, I think, the best farm pond lure you're going to get for a big largemouth is an unweighted worm, probably, just because it gives you such a neat, soft presentation. You know.
What color? Or does it matter?
I don't know. I'm like I said earlier, I'm a big believer in saying I don't know when I don't know. Color, unless I'm trying to imitate something, I have not been able to figure out. There are definite days that color makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah.
And every theory I've ever heard about it just sounds like to me like it's like a theory. You know, I mean, I haven't found anything where it's like, well, this works, this works, this works. I don't understand what is going through a bass's mind that one day, you know, a purple worm with a pink tail is better than a smoked worm with an orange tail. You know what I mean? I don't understand that. I wish I knew. That's like, to me, that's like the biggest mystery in fishing left. You know, it is the day somebody figures out color.
Yeah, you know, fish's brain's not that big. You wouldn't think it's that complicated, but they're smart suckers.
You know, I've heard it said that that's why, you know, a smallmouth or a largemouth is a smarter fish than like a trout, because a trout is used to eating, you know, this certain bug, and it's glued onto that bug unless it thinks it's that bug and it looks just like it, you know. Mm-hmm. Even though it makes him hard to catch, it kind of shows how dumb he is, because a largemouth bass will look at your, you know, your big orange popper with white legs, and in reason in its mind, even though it's never seen one, it'll think, you know, I bet I could eat that. To me, that makes him smart instead of dumb.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Actually.
Well, that's awesome, man. There's a lot of good information. Is there anything you want to add before we get off here? Do you have any sponsors or anything?
You know, I'm a huge fan of my brothers, you know, and then I want to plug Jeff, which I did in Little Miami Rods, because they're, you know, local. I used to be hooked up with Pure Fishing and would, you know, kind of push Fenwick's and Hodgman stuff, but I don't know. I just don't do that anymore. I'm just settled down to just trying to fish a lot. I know that sounds crazy, but I'm just, rather than trying to make something out of it, I guess I'm enjoying my old age and just fishing a lot. So I don't really have anybody that I'm pushing, I guess, more than buy some Steve Coomer lures.
They work. We've all caught fish. I know all three of us on this podcast have caught fish on them. And,
Yeah.
and Steve, we cannot thank you enough for your time and your information. I got to go talk to my wife and daughter and figure out where I'm going to get some more money to buy some different colored lures just for the pools instead of the pools instead of that.
It's something to think about. Yeah, like I said, you can make smallmouth bass fishing in the river as simple or as complicated as you want, or and probably both ways work.
Absolutely. And then I know you do have two books out. I know.
Yeah.
At least.
I usually sell those at the at the tackle shows in the winter. I'm just like I said, this time of year I'm just try to fish as much as I can. But yeah, every winter, at the local tackle shows or like the big one in Columbus, you can find me and I'll be selling some smallmouth books. Yeah.
I noticed Amazon has your Little Miami River book.
Oh, do they? I didn't know that. Somebody else is selling it, I guess. Huh.
And then I was able to pick it up locally, personally, down at Road
Rivers and Trails.
Road Rivers and Trails.
Yeah.
In Milford, I had it there. And
locally, I wrote that for the Little Miami Conservancy, and so they sell that. And so if you buy the Little Miami River book, the money goes to them to help conservation on the Little Miami, and they do some of the distribution of that to some of the local places, and so there are some local places that you can get it from, but they're not buying that from me. They're buying it from Little Miami Conservancy, which means if you get it, it's for a good cause. Money's going to a good cause. Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I have that Smallmouth Sunny book for my daughter, and I think that was for the Miami Conservancy, right?
Yes, it was. Yes, a good friend of mine wrote that, and I actually come up with the idea for that book, and it says so in the foreword, and I'm like, you need to write this book, and kind of pushed it on him to write the book, but all the money from that goes to the Little Miami Conservancy as well. And what I like about Smallmouth Sunny is that it's not a dinosaur or a lion from Africa. It's right here, so your kid realizes there's something here. All of our kids now get all their nature from TV, and they don't realize. I was at some little lake last year, and there was like a 6-year-old kid there, and he was afraid to get in the water. He said because there were sharks, because he's seen it on TV. You know what I mean? And I unfortunately, I feel like we're raising a generation of kids that they don't get muddy enough, and they're not out in the creek enough, and we need to make it a point to try to help them do that. We're raising a generation of kids that they see nature through their phone and their TV, and nature is something different instead of right out in the backyard.
Yeah, it's foreign to them. Yes,
it is. It absolutely is. It's not a generation where mom kicked you out of the house and said, be back at supper time, and you played in the backyard and down the street in the creek. And unfortunately, we're losing some of that, I think. Yeah. That's probably the biggest. We were talking about the threat to the local rivers and streams, and probably the biggest threat to the local rivers and streams is that the coming generation is not going to be as connected to them as the current one or the one before that. And so, you protect stuff that you care about, or that's valuable to you. I think the most, like the second or third most common animal in the world is a chicken. And the reason it's one of the most common animals in the world is because it's valuable to people, And if we raise a generation that nature's not part of their life and valuable to them, they won't see the importance in protecting it. So that's an
interesting perspective. That's great.
That's why there's white-tailed deer, because more white-tailed deer than there have been in hundreds of years, because they're valuable to people and people are hunting them, and
Yeah.
They're investing money into the conservation of them, and unfortunately, there's less hunters and less fishermen every year now. So stuff like this, probably, hopefully, does something, a little tiny part of, turn the tide. I feel like that's the big message to get out there to people is to, hey, take a kid fishing.
Oh, definitely.
It's important.
We are all about that on the Yak Legion. We are all about getting people started into fishing and the kayaking and, getting off the Xbox and out of the house and on the river. That way they have this appreciation for the river, and the next generation, will be in good hands as long as,
Absolutely.
we can keep teaching them.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're at an hour and a half now. So
Okay.
I appreciate you coming on, Steve. Man, it was awesome.
Sure. Thanks.
I can also say my favorite bass that I've ever caught was only 8 inches, and I didn't catch it. My daughter did, and it was the first fish that she caught. And that is my most memorable fish. And, coming full circle, we couldn't have asked for it to come together. Start off with the Conservancy and to end with this point to get the next generation and to get our kids out and in the water and catching the fish and respecting what we've got and cherishing it as much as we do.
Absolutely.
So it's there.
Well said. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you all for listening. I hope you all enjoyed our talk with Steve. I'm going to bid you all farewell and good night. I appreciate it again, Steve, and thank you for coming on. Thanks for listening to the Yak Legion podcast. Plenty more to come.